Hello and welcome to Of Significance, your low-cost carrier of economic analyses and rational reasoning. I'm your every person HMO, host most often, Brent Buckright here with your preferred provider, Dr. Nathan Woods, and his allowable charge, a man whose out-of-pocket maximum is always yes, and it's Dr. Steve Bronars. Steve, and then Nathan, how are you?
Not on any medications right now. They asked that at beginning of the depositions. Is there anything that you're taking that would influence your ability to answer questions? And I have to say, no, I'm not taking anything that would affect my ability to answer questions. Well, but I'm going to be asking the questions, not answering them anyway.
I'm not even going to answer the question. I'm just sitting here with my sunglasses on, trying to keep a low profile.
Just trying to white knuckle it. I don't know what's happening to my algorithms recently, but I keep getting advertisements that mention PBMs and the pharmaceutical industry, and it feels like it's a major part of our healthcare industry, but I don't know anything about it. So we needed someone to come in and make sense of medications in this conversation of significance with our very own Dr. Tram Nguyen. Hello, welcome.
Thank you.
For those of you who don't know, Tram is an expert who has spent nearly 7 years working as a consulting expert on antitrust litigation issues with a particular focus on the pharmaceutical industry and utilizing econometric tools. Her knowledge of pricing systems within the pharmaceutical industry comes from extensive experience assisting clients in multiple cases involving pay for delay, price fixing, and restrained competition allegations of pharmaceutical products. She loves spending all of her free time traveling or hanging off of a boulder wall. Tram, before you educate us about drug pricing, what kind of climbing do you do?
Oh, it's bouldering. So it's the type of climbing that you don't have a rope. You just kind of go off on your own, and then if you fall, you fall.
Wait, did you start with that level, or was it always high stakes? I'm never using a rope. I'm not using safety equipment.
No, I started with the rope one, and then I got bored of it. So I find like the fall quite thrilling.
And small boulders first, right? Before you got to bigger boulders.
So the bouldering walls are usually between, I think, 10 to 20 feet. So yeah, it depends on like how high you go. But if you go all the way to 20 feet, it's a scary fall.
Is it always, are you doing always indoor or?
Oh, this is only indoor.
Oh, okay. I don't know anything about bouldering other than that it has rocks with it.
Yeah, but falling from 20 feet indoors is no better than outdoors.
But they have like mats and stuff.
Yeah. The mats are padded.
And people who will catch you.
No,
with like those giant
there's
trampolines.
No one catching you.
No, it's super safe. A fall from 20 feet, it's easy breezy.
Gotcha.
Tram, did they make you sign anything before you do that?
Yeah, you sign a waiver.
Yeah. That's
why
scary.
Steve, are you thinking about getting into climbing?
No, I'm not thinking about that. I'm just saying that if it's really so safe, why are they having you sign a waiver? Even though I'm not an attorney, so I wouldn't know. But
litigation is big here.
So I want to talk about the pharmaceutical industry. It's, as we all know, very complex, and I'm wondering if you can help us wrap our heads around what's happening. So I'm a consumer who has health insurance. I want to get a medication. Generally, step one for me is to go to a doctor. They give me a prescription, and then I just go pick it up from a pharmacy. But there's a lot going on in the background. Can you help me make sense of like what are the big components that I need to understand about how these prices are set or how I'm actually getting any of my medications?
Yeah, so you're already 2 steps ahead by going to the pharmacy. So at the pharmacies, you get your drugs filled in your prescription, right? And the way that it works is your drug has to travel from the manufacturer through a wholesaler and then to the pharmacies where they dispense you the prescriptions. So that's the flow of the product. But then in the background, the more complex system is the payment chain. So it doesn't stop when you pay your copay at the pharmacies. Assuming you have insurance, your insurance is also covering most of the cost. And to determine how much they're paying for the rest of your prescription, there's another third party, the middleman called the PPMs, pharmacy benefit manager. They come in and they negotiate drug prices between them, the pharmacies, and the manufacturers. So all of that is going to determine how much your insurance pays for the rest of your prescription.
So, okay, the pharmacy, it's a pharmacy benefit manager.
Mm-hmm.
Why does the health insurance carrier negotiate with them rather than just negotiating with the manufacturers in the first place?
You can imagine there are thousands, I guess, tens of thousands of health insurance carriers in the US, right? And if each of them negotiates with the pharmacies or the manufacturers individually, that's a lot of work. So that's why the pharmacy benefit managers, the PBMs, come in. It's kind of a collective bargaining power. They contract with all the individual health insurance carriers, and then they negotiate with pharmacies and manufacturers on behalf of all of their clients. They also create their own pharmacy network where they might have better pricing with their in-network pharmacies versus pharmacies that are not in-network. So all of that is supposed to be beneficial for consumers or the health plan carrier, the insurance carriers, because they're getting better prices.
Wait, so that's actually kind of interesting. So I guess the way I had assumed it would work is that the PBMs are working on behalf of manufacturers or with the interest of manufacturers. The way you just described it sounds more like their interest is going to be on the side of carriers. Mm-hmm. How are they making money? How are they operating? Like, I would have thought the direction would be that if I was a manufacturer, I need to get a PBM operation to sell our drugs at a certain price, but it's the other way around.
It's the other way around. So the PBMs work on behalf of the insurance and the health plans, but the manufacturers need the PBM so that they can sell their drugs. So the drugs should be based on a formulary designed by the PBM. So the manufacturers have incentive to put their drugs in the formulary so that the drug is covered by your insurance. And in some situations, the manufacturers can also pay the PBMs the rebates to keep drug pricing low or to keep their drugs on a lower tier in the formulary and make it more accessible to consumers. But the PBMs are negotiating on behalf of the health insurance carriers because they work with the carrier, they contract with the carriers, not the manufacturers.
Gotcha.
So Tram, how long have these PBMs been around? Has this been around quite a long time, or is this a newer development to have these kind of brokers or whatever you would call them in between the different parties?
I don't know the exact number of years, but they've been around for a long time.
Okay. Is this always operated sort of, at least a little bit behind the scenes, that you're just like the story Brent told, like you're not even aware that there's PBMs when you go and get your prescription filled?
Yeah, I think most
so it's kind of invisible.
Most consumers are not aware of PBMs, basically because we don't hear about these names. They're not household names. But if you look at the back of your insurance card, usually they are there in like a very small print.
They've been there the whole time.
Yeah, I just discovered ours yesterday preparing for this podcast.
Did you find it on the insurance card?
I'm very upset with them. I went looking, just preparing. I went looking for a drug.
Sure.
So, we go into the portal.
A drug.
That's how we always prepare for the podcast. We look for a drug.
And, we're on our little
web care portal.
Carrier. Right, exactly. I'm giving away that I'm not a power user of our pharmacy benefits. But and so I went looking for the drug, and it takes you off of that portal and onto the PBM website, basically. And you don't really know that until you look carefully and you realize, I'm no longer in the same place. And by the way, they didn't even have the drug I was looking for. So I'm upset. It's the PBM's fault, right?
So in that case, the drug you're looking for is not covered. It's not in the formulary. And they can do that. They can exclude certain drugs. They can include only similar type of drugs for the same treatment.
It feels like it's really weird to try and think about how anything is actually priced, because there's dozens of parties who are arguing about whole rosters of information that I would never even think about, or it makes the kind of transaction very different than, say, going to a grocery store, I guess, where I'm picking the specific items I want to get rather than a bundle.
I think you're hitting the point that that's why drug prices are not transparent to end consumers like us, right? Like you know your copay, your coinsurance when you go to a pharmacy for your prescription, but you don't actually know how much it would cost if you were going to pay out of pocket. If you were not insured and you have to pay cash, it's going to be a different price. If you now switch job, which I hope you don't, but if you switch job and you're under a different insurance plan, your cost might be different because you're going to be under a different PPM, for example.
We'll see how the episode goes, Brent.
I didn't realize it was such high stakes now. So I mentioned groceries, but there are a lot of layers between me and the final end product. Is that something that is truly unique to the healthcare industry? Are there any other industries that have something like PBMs and I'm just not aware of it? It seems like it's weird that this system is set up this way.
Mm-hmm. I'm not aware of any other industry that has a middleman like PBM. I mean, the regular industry have wholesalers and retailers, and then the product goes to the end consumer. But I don't think there's a third party that makes all of the negotiations and deals behind the background that influence what we actually pay.
So can you explain maybe then why you have to bundle prescription medications in these kinds of deals? Like why is it that I need to purchase X drug, at A price and B drug at Z price?
Well, I think the whole thing started to be to bring efficiency, right? Like it's more efficient to have a list of drugs that the PPM or your health insurance will cover, and then agree on a set of prices to cover these drugs from these manufacturers, put them in different tiers to influence consumer decision to choose the cheaper drugs and keep healthcare costs low. I think that was like the original goal. But then it became very complex because the negotiations go through so many parties in the middle. And then there's different payments flow. Either they are rebates from the manufacturers to the PPM. Some of the rebates can go to the healthcare insurance that might help keeping costs low. But all of that is going to affect the final price of drugs. And that's why I think we end up here with like a lot of parties involved. And then it's impossible to figure out the actual prices of one product.
And as you were describing that, I am thinking of brand name drugs as opposed to a bunch of generics. If most of the drugs were available as generics and there weren't as many that were still brand names under a patent, would you really need the PBMs? Or are these efficiencies that we're talking about related more to the fact that there are a bunch of drugs out there that have these higher prices because they're still under these patents?
I think you bring up a good point that in a lot of cases, when there are many generic drugs in the market, then the brand name is no longer in the market effectively. Nobody is filling their prescription with the brand names, except for special cases where the drugs might be life-saving devices that people, for some reason, trust the brand more than generics. But you can think of like a regular pharmaceuticals that mostly generic these days, and there are multiple manufacturers of the same generic. But the PBM still cares about competition between these generics. They usually set a maximum allowed price that they would reimburse for that generic drug. And then all the manufacturers, in theory, should be competing to keep their prices below that maximum price. And the pharmacies have incentive to source the cheapest generics because they're making a margin based on that, right?
Right. Even in that case where you'd think there would be a lot of competition and maybe an intermediary to help negotiate these things, there could still be some benefit there in certain cases. Okay.
Right. And we're talking about like a very large volume of generics. So even if the competition brings it down by a few cents per pill, that's still going to be a reasonable amount of savings.
Got it.
So I'm a consumer. I think I understand the market a little bit more. And maybe even if I don't I'm not able to perceive the benefit of a PBM because in reality, I'm a person who's just got his insurance. I go pick up the prescriptions. There's arguably some efficiency gains from them existing. But of course, there's tons of litigation associated with artificially high prices and anti-competitive behavior. Would you mind just kind of laying out what the litigation looks like around drug prices and where the areas that people most often target for a class action type lawsuit?
So let's pick one common case of pharmaceutical litigation related to the brand and generic dynamics that Steve was talking about. It's called a pay for delay type of case. This is a situation where you first have a brand name manufacturer in the market, and they usually have a patent that protects their market until the patent expires. A generic manufacturer can, at some point, sue whether the patent is legit or not, and then try to bring generic into the market earlier. And then in situations like that, the brand and the generic manufacturers can reach an agreement where the generic manufacturer agrees to stop suing the brand manufacturer and then delay the generic entry into the market. But then the brand manufacturer in exchange can offer some payment, whether in the form of cash or the delay in some other products, and that's called the reverse payment or pay for delay. So in that situation, the brand name can stay in the market for longer, the generic is delayed, and then consumers often bring the lawsuit because if the generic entry would have happened earlier, we would have the option of switching, paying for a cheaper drug, and then the healthcare insurance carriers can also pay less for the prescriptions, right? So the consumer class in that case often includes both the individual consumers like us or our health insurance or our employers who are covering the cost.
And they're jointly bringing that against
the manufacturers.
Allegedly conspiring
right.
manufacturers.
Is it the kind of thing where the insurers and the individual consumers are all lumped in together in one class, or are they more often split? Does it depend on case by case?
Depends on case by case. We've seen them clump into the same class. We've seen them in one class but divided into two subclass, which are the individual consumer class and then the third party payer class. We've also seen only the health insurance carriers and employers in one class without the individual consumers.
Does it vary by state where the different levels of the consumers can recover, or like, in some of these other cases, or is it pretty much wherever you are in the U.S., it could be, it would look the same, or some of those differences you're describing depend on the jurisdiction? Do you know?
I don't think I've seen a case where it depends on the states. It's usually
Okay.
the entire U.S.
Right, because like there is that Illinois brick, and whether
I think you're talking about the indirect purchasers, and those are usually the case where the retailers and the pharmacies would sue the manufacturer, so they are the indirect purchasers in those cases.
Right.
But
that's different than the insurance
that's different
companies.
From the,
because
that's
they're
different
both
from the
kind
end
of
payers.
Two different types of end payers,
right?
Rather than an indirect. Okay.
So we spend a lot of time talking about class certification applications all over the place on this podcast. What is it in the data that you would be analyzing that would, in a prototypical kind of case, that would support, let's say, an allegation that this pay for delay was going on? Is there something in the data that you would see that would support that, or conversely make it clear that that was not what was going on, or is it more documents? How's that analysis work?
So if we're talking about class certs, usually we would ideally have data to show us whether consumers actually switch to the generics and how long it takes for the entire market to switch. So we would have third-party data or data from the PPM, transactional claims data, that would show, for example, you would see at the beginning of the year when there was only the brand, everybody was buying the brand. the branded drugs. But let's say in January, generics came in, and then you started seeing people refilling their prescription with the generics instead of the brand. And then by the end of the year, you might see 60-70% of the market switch to generics. So that would be one example where we see the markets behave as expected by the literature, where generic came in, most prescription will be switched to generics. In certain cases, you might have multiple generics that came in, and then this switch might happen earlier because they start competing on prices, and it might even bring prices lower than with only one generic manufacturer.
But if somebody was successful in getting the delay, so the generic doesn't come in, how does that get demonstrated that was the cause? That it was not some sort of, that the patent wasn't valid and they should have been delayed, as opposed to this kind of buy-off that seems like is being described.
I don't think we as economists can testify on the validity of the patent. I think we can only see or observe what actually happened. But in cases where it didn't happen, like you said, if the generic didn't come in, often what happened is we look at, or the plaintiff's expert would look at a similar market, a similar drugs where the generic entry happened earlier, and then extrapolate that over to this market of this specific drug. Or they can rely on the literature where it's just look at a bunch of drugs, different pharmaceuticals over time, and then kind of come up with, say, 80% of the market would switch to generic within X amount of time.
And then prices would have
And prices
gone
would have,
down by X %,
exactly.
something like that. Okay.
So Tram,
Interesting.
I'm picturing a chart with, this is always good on a podcast to have people picture.
Just use your hands to describe it, though, for sure.
Use your drugs to describe it, Steve.
Where you have time on the x-axis, and then you have like this sort of S-shaped curve where it takes a little while, and then people start switching over, then it flattens out. But it seems like just because in some other brand name to generic, 70% of the people in your example switched over to the generic by the end of the year, the people who were not as willing to switch over to the generic, or it took them longer, wouldn't their damages be different than somebody who's like, as soon as the generic's there, I'm switching? And so all this delay is costing me because I'm paying a higher price than I would have in the but-for world where there was a generic out there. How would you know, or do they even try to figure out, well, which of the type of customers were harmed more? See, we all had a prescription that we're going to have to take this drug, regularly. So it's not even like it's a chronic condition that you're taking the drug for. Is it even possible to do that?
Yeah, I think that it's a very common analysis that we have to deal with, actually. So you brought up a good point of, let's assume if 80% of the market was switched to generic, but it doesn't actually apply to the individual consumer, right? So this is a very common class cert point. Each consumer has a different probability of switching from brand to generic depending on their own personal preference, their doctor's preferences, the structure of their insurance benefits. Like, for example, if I only have a $10 copay for the brand and $5 copay for the generic, my tendency of switching to the generic might not be as high as you, Steve, if you have to pay $50 for the brand, but only $10 for the generic. But that's silly because we're under the same insurance plan. But when you talk about individual class members, that's what happens. So it's not easy to assume the same 80% probability of switching when you look at individual consumers. And then when you look at the health plan levels or the plan sponsors, you have to account for all of the individual members under that plan. And then the question becomes, what is the probability of everybody under this health plan switch to generic? So there's these kind of differences when we talk about class cert issues in pay for delay that we have to account for. And I think another situation is if you talk about different type of drugs. So this argument might apply for like a simple generic drug, but if you're talking about something that is a life-saving device, right, then people might trust the brand more. And then it's not easy to extrapolate the 70-80% to a different product.
Yeah, I think Nathan is the kind of person that is not going to switch to the generic until there's like they just take the brand name off the market because basically no one's buying it. Would you agree with that, Nathan? That's your mindset.
Yeah, I mean, if the difference was what Tram was just saying,
like
I think I
$10
think
versus
it's
$5, right?
Yeah.
It was
But
like,
yeah,
come on.
if we're talking about switching toothpaste, I don't. Yeah, no chance. Because
They call him Brand Nathan Woods.
and I'm pretty wedded to my red sauce,
he's brand loyal,
which I would mention,
notice
except for
about him.
we don't have any
Yeah.
advertisers.
Right. That was like a really interesting point that you raised, Tram. Like, it was the difference is $10 and $5. I mean, why would those people switch? Certainly not as quickly as people facing a bigger marginal difference in the cost of the prescription.
Well, I would add that some states, I think, now have a law where the pharmacies have to automatically substitute your branded drug with a generic if it's available. So that might be causing, forcing Nathan to switch even if he's refusing to.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I used to believe that they all work the same, but I've been told that they don't have to, even though the active ingredients are
because
the same.
the inactive ingredients are different.
Yeah, so that mind blowing.
So right now there's been an explosion in the use of weight loss drugs because it's a fairly new technology that's been developed in medication. It's pretty revolutionary, but the pharmaceutical industry isn't completely foreign to having breakthrough type medications. Is there any ability when you're analyzing this kind of litigation to account for the fact that this new drug is so new relative to everything else that's out there in the industry, and that switching to a generic might not be something that people do as frequently as any of the other drugs that you could potentially compare it to?
Yeah, certainly. I think that would go into the characteristics of the drug. Usually in like a perfect regression, we would try to account for all sort of supply and demand conditions for this particular product, right? And probably whether there are similar type of drugs in the market, like this weight loss drug, might be in the bucket of different characteristic of the drug that you need to account for in your model, which might alter demand for this drug differently than demand for some drugs that have 10 different alternative options in the market. I would think that's where it's going to go. But yeah, I think all of this goes into the question of if you have a very new drug in the market, how would you measure the tendency of people switching from brand to generic? And I don't think it's simple as you can take another product and just blindly apply that to this new market.
So if I'm thinking about the class as a whole, as a consumer of prescription medication, I mean, I guess I think about classes in other contexts where you often have an opportunity to either opt in or opt out. As a consumer of medications, do I have the ability to opt into these kinds of classes, or how is the class size determined? How do you tell whether or not I'm eligible?
It is a different issues to determine who's actually in and out of the class, Brent. I think for individual consumers, it's actually easier to know if you're in the class because there's a record of your purchase at the pharmacy. The PBM keeps track of all of these transactions, so it's easier to find an individual consumer and know exactly which day you went to the pharmacy and how much you pay for your prescription. When it comes to your employer, in this case, Edgeworth, or the health plan carrier, it's harder to know who they are in the data, if they're actually paying for the prescription or it's another party covering the cost. So that's the issue with class cert that we sometimes deal with on ascertainability. The PBM data can track the payment coming from employer or coming from the healthcare carriers to the pharmacies, but it doesn't have enough information in most cases to tell us the financial relationship between the health plan carrier and the employer. So there are more than two types, but I'm just going to cover the two basic types of employer health plans. Some are called the self-funded and some are fully insured. So self-funded means that if you have a large enough employers, they can just pay for the prescription cost of their employees themselves. But a smaller company like Edgeworth might find it more beneficial to just pay a premium per person to a health insurance company, and then we'll cover the rest of your prescription cost. So we would be fully insured in that case. So now you can see the two sides of the coins, right? If the PPM data doesn't actually tell us if Edgeworth is fully insured or self-insured in that case, then we don't really know who the end payer is in that class. And it makes it much harder to identify the actual class members.
We're going to come back to the whole pharmaceutical industry, I think. I think we've got a lot of questions, and even though
Tram's got to answer them. Dadgummit.
Tram
Part
helped.
two.
Yeah, Tram helped us climb that wall, but I don't know if
you got to fall.
We didn't make
I'm
it
gonna
all
fall.
20 feet up before we fell down. We made it about 10 feet up and fell.
Thank you very much, Tram, for talking us through all this, and I guess happy prescription purchases.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLamara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.